Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. I can still smell the burning sage in the air. Even now, sitting in the safety of my own home, far from those cursed mountains, the stench of it clings to me like smoke in the back of my throat. And every night, I wake up drenched in sweat, the echo of that unholy cry reverberating in my ears. It began 3 months ago, and it all started because I didn't listen. My name is Lucas. I was 28 when I made the worst mistake of my life. Growing up in the city, I had always been drawn to the outdoors, but nothing more than your usual weekend hikes or occasional camping trips. That was until I got a job offer in New Mexico as a wildlife photographer. The job took me into the heart of some of the most remote places in the state, and I thought I could handle it. I'd been on plenty of treks alone before. I thought this would be just another adventure, but the people here warned me repeatedly. Stay away from the Navajo lands, they'd say. Don't stray from the marked paths, and whatever you do, never, ever go near the old trails after dark. I should have listened. It was late August when I set out on a 2-week trip to the Chuska Mountains, deep in the heart of Navajo territory. My task was simple: document the wildlife, capture the beauty of the place, and send the photos back to my employer. But I wanted something more, something that would make me stand out. I had heard rumors, old, whispered stories about strange creatures that roamed the night. Skinwalkers, they called them. At first, I brushed it off as local folklore, a way to keep tourists from wandering too far. But the more people warned me, the more intrigued I became. I've always been skeptical of supernatural tales. The idea of creatures that could shapeshift, take the form of any animal or even a person, sounded ridiculous. The first few days were peaceful. I set up camp by a small river and spent my time hiking, taking pictures of elk, birds, and the occasional fox. The landscape was breathtaking. Craggy cliffs, towering pines, and an endless stretch of sky that made you feel insignificant beneath it. The isolation didn't bother me. In fact, I relished it. But on the 5th night, things began to change. I was sitting by the fire, reviewing the day's shots, when I heard it. A distant, guttural howl. At first I thought it was a coyote, but this sound was wrong. It was too deep, too resonant. It chilled me to my core, like it carried with it a sense of malice. I shrugged it off as an overactive imagination and turned in for the night. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I drifted off, I'd hear movement outside the tent. Soft footsteps, almost human, but not quite. When I gathered the courage to peek outside, nothing was there. Just the endless dark of the woods. The next morning, I found tracks around my campsite. Large, clawed footprints that seemed to belong to no animal I'd ever seen. They circled my tent, erratic, as if something had been pacing back and forth, watching me while I slept. Unease crept in, but I told myself it was a bear. Or maybe a wolf. Anything other than what those old stories suggested. That evening, I decided to push deeper into the forest, hoping to shake the unnerving feeling. As the sun began to set, I spotted something in the distance. An old, overgrown trail leading up into the mountains. There were no signs marking it, nothing on my map. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I followed it for miles as the sky turned crimson, then deepened to a violet twilight. The forest grew quieter, and with every step, the air felt heavier, oppressive. The further I went, the less natural everything seemed. No birds, no wind, just silence, thick and unnerving. And then I saw it. At first, it looked like a deer, thin, gaunt, standing motionless in the middle of the path. But its legs, they were wrong. Too long, too thin. And its head? God, its head. The antlers were twisted, gnarled like the branches of a dead tree. And its eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. Black, bottomless pits that seemed to stare right through me. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. My instinct screamed at me to turn around to run, but I was rooted to the spot, as if the creature had some hold over me. And then it moved. Slow at first, then faster, like a predator stalking prey. But the way it moved was all wrong. Jerky, unnatural, like something imitating the way an animal should walk. I stumbled backward, the camera slipping from my hand, and bolted down the trail. I didn't look back, but I could hear it behind me. Heavy, rapid footsteps, impossibly fast, closing the distance. I don't know how long I ran, but I didn't stop until I reached my camp. By the time I collapsed near the fire, my lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly. I sat there, gasping for breath, staring into the woods, waiting for whatever that thing was to emerge from the darkness. But it didn't. That night, the howling returned, louder this time, closer. I lay awake in my tent, every muscle tensed, listening to the low growls and the soft rustling of leaves just outside. I kept the knife by my side, though I knew it wouldn't be enough. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my gear in a frenzy, my hands shaking, my nerves on edge. But when I stepped outside the tent, I saw them again. Those same tracks, leading away from my camp this time, deeper into the mountains. But they weren't alone. Beside them, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Human footprints. Bare, with long clawed toes. I didn't waste any more time. I slung my pack over my shoulder and started down the mountain as fast as I could. The journey back was a blur. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting that thing to come charging out of the woods after me. It wasn't until I reached my car that I felt the slightest bit of relief. I threw my gear into the back seat and sped off, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. But it wasn't over. For weeks after I returned home, the nightmares plagued me. I would wake up in the dead of night, the same cry echoing in my head. And worse, sometimes I could hear it outside my window, far in the distance but unmistakable. Then, a few nights ago, I woke up to find those same clawed footprints in my backyard. They circled my house, erratic, just like they had around my tent. Whatever I had encountered in those mountains, it had followed me. And now, I can't escape. I've done everything. Burnt sage, hung talismans, even visited a Navajo healer who told me I had crossed into forbidden territory. He said the skinwalker had marked me, that once you've seen one, it never truly lets you go. I don't know how much longer I have. I can feel it getting closer. The air around me feels heavy again, oppressive, just like it did in the mountains. Every night the howling gets louder. Every morning the footprints come closer to my door. And tonight, as I sit here writing this, I know it's watching me. I can hear it. It's outside. I never believed in curses or haunted objects. Those were just stories people told to scare each other. I was a skeptic, the kind of person who laughed at ghost stories and rolled my eyes at paranormal TV shows. But that was before the mirror, the one that changed everything. My name is Mark, and this is my story. I'm 32 years old, and until a few months ago I was living a perfectly normal life in my small apartment in Boston. I work as a software developer. Nothing glamorous, but it pays the bills. My life was predictable and comfortable until I made the mistake of bringing home an antique mirror I found at an estate sale. It was a Saturday morning when I first saw it. I hadn't planned on going to the sale, but I had some free time, and it was only a few blocks away. The house belonged to an old woman who had passed away, and the place was full of dusty, forgotten relics. Most of the stuff wasn't worth a second glance. Old furniture, books, and knickknacks. But then I saw the mirror. It was tucked away in a corner of the living room, standing about 6 feet tall with a heavy, ornate frame carved from dark wood. The carvings were intricate, twisting vines and strange, almost human-like faces staring out from the wood. Despite the dust covering its surface, the glass was perfectly clear, reflecting the room with an eerie precision. I don't know why, but the moment I saw it, I felt drawn to it. Like there was something about it that needed to come home with me. The man running the sale was eager to get rid of it. He sold it to me for $50, without a second thought. "Good riddance," he muttered under his breath as I handed him the money, but I didn't pay much attention at the time. I should have asked why he was so eager to part with it, but I didn't. I was too excited by my new find. I hauled the mirror back to my apartment, placing it in the corner of my living room where it seemed to fit perfectly. For the first few days, everything was normal. I barely noticed it, to be honest, except for the occasional glance as I walked by. Then things started to happen. It began with small, almost imperceptible things. Things you could easily chalk up to coincidence. I'd come home from work and find objects slightly out of place. My keys would be on the kitchen counter instead of by the door where I always left them. A book would be lying open on the coffee table, though I was sure I hadn't touched it in days. At first I shrugged it off, blaming it on my own forgetfulness. But then it got worse. One night, about a week after I brought the mirror home, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost like the wind, but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, but when I opened the window, the night was still. The whispering continued, growing louder. It seemed to be coming from the living room. I got out of bed and cautiously made my way down the hall. As I entered the living room, the whispering stopped. Everything was quiet, but I felt an odd chill in the air, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees. My eyes were drawn to the mirror. At that moment, I could have sworn I saw something. Just a flicker of movement in the glass. A shadow, perhaps, or maybe a reflection. But when I looked more closely, there was nothing there. Just my own pale face staring back at me. I tried to shake off the unease and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The whispering had unsettled me, though I told myself it was probably just a dream. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next day, things escalated. I was sitting on the couch, working on my laptop, when I felt it again, that sensation of being watched. I looked up, and my eyes were immediately drawn to the mirror. This time, I didn't just see a flicker. I saw something move, clearly, unmistakably. It was like a shadow, drifting across the glass. But there was nothing behind me that could have cast such a reflection. No one else was in the room. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and approached the mirror. My reflection stared back at me. But something was wrong. It was subtle at first, but as I stared, the differences became more pronounced. My reflection wasn't moving in sync with me. It was delayed, just by a fraction of a second, but enough to notice. And then it smiled. I didn't. My heart raced, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table. I blinked, and the reflection was back to normal, my terrified face staring out of the glass. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but nothing made sense. I knew what I had seen. My reflection had moved on its own. It had smiled at me. From that moment on, the mirror became a source of dread. I avoided looking at it as much as possible, but it was always there, looming in the corner of the room. The whispering continued at night, growing louder, more insistent. Sometimes I could almost make out words, but they were always just beyond understanding, like someone speaking in a language I didn't know. Then came the nightmares. In my dreams, I would find myself standing in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. But it wasn't my reflection, not really. The thing in the mirror looked like me, but its eyes were wrong, black, empty voids that seemed to swallow the light. It would smile that same eerie smile, and then, slowly, it would reach out, pressing its hand against the glass. I could feel it pulling me, dragging me toward the mirror. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest, the sensation of being pulled lingering even after I woke. I knew I had to get rid of the mirror, but I couldn't. Every time I tried, something stopped me. I would walk up to it, ready to drag it out of the apartment, but then a strange calm would wash over me, and I'd find myself hesitating, my hand frozen just inches from the frame. It was as though the mirror had a hold on me, something deep and unshakable. One night, after yet another sleepless night filled with whispers and nightmares, I decided enough was enough. I grabbed a blanket, threw it over the mirror, and shoved it into the corner. Out of sight, out of mind, I thought. But the whispering didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. That's when I decided to do some research. I needed answers. I went back to the estate sale, hoping to find someone who could tell me more about the mirror. The man who sold it to me was gone, but I managed to track down one of the neighbors who had known the previous owner. The old woman, he told me, had been something of a recluse. No one saw much of her, and when they did, she was always muttering to herself, carrying strange objects from her home. But the one thing everyone remembered was the mirror. It had been in her family for generations, passed down through the women of the family. According to the neighbor, there was a story that the mirror was cursed, that it had trapped the soul of someone long ago. I laughed nervously when he told me this, but my stomach churned with unease. She always said the mirror had a life of its own, the neighbor said. Said it was haunted, that it could trap you if you weren't careful. It's why no one else wanted it after she passed. I went home feeling more unsettled than ever. If the mirror was truly cursed, what had I gotten myself into? That night, the dream came again, but this time, it was worse. In the dream, I was standing in front of the mirror, as usual, but this time, when my reflection reached out, I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, frozen in place as the thing in the mirror grinned at me, its eyes black and soulless. Slowly, its hand pressed against the glass, and then, impossibly, it pushed through. I felt a cold, clammy hand wrap around my wrist, and in that instant, I knew what it wanted. It wanted to pull me in, to trap me inside the mirror, just like the soul that had been taken long ago. I woke up screaming, my wrist icy cold, as though something had really touched me. I ran to the living room, heart racing, and yanked the blanket off the mirror. My reflection was there, staring back at me, but I could feel it. Something wasn't right. I don't know how to explain it, but I could feel it watching me. It wasn't just a reflection. It was something else, something alive. I tried to throw the mirror out that night. I grabbed it, dragged it down to the dumpster behind my building, and left it there, covered in garbage. But when I woke up the next morning, it was back. Standing in the corner of my living room, exactly where it had been before, as though I had never moved it. I was trapped. There was no escape. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. The whispers are constant now, always calling to me, always pulling me toward the mirror. And every time I look at my reflection, I see it, the thing inside, waiting, smiling. One day I know it's going to win. One day I'm going to look in the mirror and see myself, but it won't be me. It'll be something else, and my soul will be trapped inside, forever. I first noticed it a little past midnight on that long, empty stretch of highway just outside of town. It was one of those nights where the air feels heavy, almost oppressive, like a storm's brewing, but never quite arrives. I was exhausted after a late shift at the diner, barely able to keep my eyes open as I drove, the hum of the tires lulling me into a half-conscious daze. That's when I saw the headlights. At first I didn't think much of it. Just another car, right? But something about it felt off. The black sedan, sleek and silent, glided onto the highway behind me, its headlights too bright in the rearview mirror. I squinted, trying to shake the creeping unease as the car kept its distance. Too far to be tailgating, but too close to feel normal. I checked the clock on the dashboard, 12:45 a.m. This stretch of road wasn't usually busy this late. In fact, it was almost always deserted, just the way I liked it. No distractions, no noise, just the road and the dark. But now, there was this car. I pressed down on the gas, watching the needle on the speedometer climb. 60, 65, 70. I'm not sure what I was trying to prove. Maybe I wanted to lose it, convince myself it wasn't really following me. But when I looked back in the rearview mirror, the car had sped up too, still keeping that unsettling distance. Always there, lurking just beyond my reach. A chill ran down my spine. I rubbed my eyes, trying to snap myself out of it. Maybe I was just imagining things, letting my exhaustion get the better of me. But the headlights remained steady, unwavering. I turned off the main highway, taking a back road that would shave a few minutes off my drive home. The kind of road where the trees crowd in on both sides, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching into the night. My pulse quickened as I realized the black car had followed me. I took another turn, sharper this time, my tires skidding slightly on the damp pavement. The car behind me mirrored my movements with eerie precision, as if it had anticipated my every decision. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel now, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. What the hell was this? I wasn't a paranoid guy. I'd never believed in ghosts or spirits or any of that supernatural crap. But this was something else. Something real. Something dangerous. I considered pulling over, letting it pass me, but a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach told me that would be a mistake. Whatever was in that car, it wasn't just another late-night driver. It felt like it was toying with me, playing some kind of sick game, the kind you don't walk away from. Suddenly, the headlights blinked off. Just like that, the road behind me plunged into darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the rearview mirror, but there was nothing. No car, no lights, just the empty blackness of the road stretching out behind me. I slowed down, craning my neck to get a better look. Had the car turned off? Disappeared? My mind raced, searching for explanations that didn't involve the terrifying thoughts creeping into my head. But then, the lights reappeared. They weren't behind me anymore. They were in front of me. The black car was now blocking the road ahead, its headlights burning into my eyes like two white-hot orbs. My stomach lurched as I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching in protest. How had it gotten in front of me so fast? I hadn't even heard an engine. I hadn't seen it pass me. I threw the car into reverse, my heart hammering as I sped backward down the narrow road, the black sedan growing smaller in the distance. But the further I got, the faster it seemed to close the gap, as if it was drawing me back toward it. I swerved off the road, the underbrush scratching against my car as I veered onto a narrow dirt path. The woods closed in around me, thick and oppressive, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. For a brief moment, I thought I had lost it. The headlights vanished again, swallowed by the trees. I exhaled, the tension in my chest loosening, and I slowed down just enough to catch my breath. Maybe it had been some kind of trick of the light, a coincidence. Maybe my mind was playing games with me after all. But then I saw it. A flash of movement in the trees to my right. The unmistakable gleam of headlights cutting through the dense forest, weaving between the trunks like a predator stalking its prey. The black car wasn't just following me on the road anymore. It was hunting me. I floored the gas pedal, the car bouncing and jolting over the uneven terrain. Branches whipped against the windows, and I could barely see a few feet ahead. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The black car was closing in, and I knew if it caught me, I wouldn't survive the night. I don't know how long I drove like that. Seconds? Minutes? Time felt warped, distorted, like the night itself was bending around me. But eventually the path opened up, and I found myself back on a paved road, a familiar road, my neighborhood. Relief flooded through me as I saw the warm glow of streetlights and houses in the distance. I turned onto my street, my body trembling with exhaustion, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. But as I pulled into my driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that the black car was still out there, lurking just beyond the edge of the dark, waiting for me to let my guard down. I cut the engine and sat in the silence for a moment, staring at the empty road. The black car was gone, but the fear remained. I stepped out of the car, glancing around one last time before heading toward my front door. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my keys, and I almost dropped them twice before finally unlocking the door. I stepped inside, slamming the door behind me, and leaned against it, breathing hard. Safe. I was safe. But then, I heard it. A low rumble, the unmistakable growl of an engine idling outside my house. I froze. Slowly, I turned and peered through the peephole. The black car was parked across the street, its headlights off, the engine still running. It sat there, silent and still, like a predator waiting in the shadows. I didn't move, I didn't breathe, because deep down I knew it would always be there, watching, waiting, following me into the dark. I never imagined I'd end up serving on a submarine, much less one with a reputation for being haunted. But when you enlist in the Navy, you take what you get, and I'd been assigned to the USS Blackwater, a decommissioned submarine that had seen its fair share of action in the Cold War. Its history was colorful, to say the least. Rumors of strange accidents, unexplained disappearances, and the infamous incident that had supposedly driven an entire crew mad. But I didn't believe in ghost stories, not at first. I was 28, fresh out of training, and eager to prove myself. Submarine duty wasn't for the faint of heart. Living in cramped quarters, submerged for months on end, with no sunlight and little space to breathe. It was a challenge, but I was ready for it. At least, that's what I thought when I first stepped aboard the Blackwater. From the moment I set foot on the sub, though, something felt off. The air inside was stale and thick, like the walls themselves were soaked in years of secrecy and silence. The crew was sparse, mostly veterans who had served on the Blackwater before its decommissioning. There were only a few of us new recruits, and we all had the same uneasy look in our eyes as we tried to acclimate to the dim, metallic confines of the sub. Chief Petty Officer Grayson, a grizzled man with more years underwater than I could count, gave us the grand tour. The Blackwater wasn't a huge vessel, but it was still a maze of narrow corridors, hatches, and cramped living quarters. As Grayson led us deeper into the belly of the sub, he pointed out the various stations, the control room, the engine room, the torpedo bay. His voice was low, almost as if he didn't want to disturb the quiet that clung to every corner. "You might hear some stories about this old tub," Grayson muttered as we passed a bulkhead marked with a faded number. "Forget 'em, it's just the sub playing tricks on you." The other recruits and I exchanged uneasy glances. We hadn't heard any stories yet, but the way Grayson said it, with that knowing glint in his eye, made it clear that we soon would. The first few days on the Blackwater were uneventful. We ran drills, checked equipment, and got used to the constant hum of the sub's systems. But at night, when the lights dimmed and the only sound was the gentle thrum of the engines, that's when things started to change. The first incident happened to one of the other new guys, Ramirez. He'd been assigned to the night watch, monitoring the sonar in the control room. I'd just finished my shift and was about to crash in my bunk when he came running down the corridor, his face pale as a sheet. "Did you see it?" he gasped, grabbing my arm. "See what?" I asked, taken aback by the fear in his eyes. "The figure," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "In the control room. I thought it was one of the officers at first, but when I turned around, it was gone." A chill ran down my spine. I tried to brush it off, telling myself he was just tired, maybe seeing things after hours of staring at the sonar screen. But then I noticed the other crew members, veterans who'd been on the Blackwater for years, casting glances at each other, their expressions grim. That's when I learned about the incident. It had happened years ago during the sub's active service. A routine mission had gone horribly wrong, resulting in the deaths of several crew members. The details were sketchy, with conflicting reports and redacted documents, but the official story was some kind of malfunction. The unofficial story, the one passed around in hushed whispers, was that the crew had gone mad. One by one, they had succumbed to some unseen force, hallucinating, hearing voices, seeing things that weren't there, until they turned on each other. The sub had been docked for years after that, abandoned like a ghost ship, before being recommissioned for training purposes. And now, here we were, the unlucky few tasked with bringing the Blackwater back to life. I didn't want to believe it. I'd never been superstitious, never put stock in ghost stories or the paranormal. But as the days passed, strange things started happening. It was subtle at first. Lights flickering, strange noises in the corridors, a sense of being watched. But then it got worse. I was in the engine room, running a routine check, when I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. The engine room was isolated, deep in the sub, and I was supposed to be alone. I turned, expecting to see one of the other crew members, but there was no one there. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, echoing off the metal walls. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick, heavy, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I turned back to my work, trying to shake off the feeling of unease, but it clung to me like a second skin. I finished my check as quickly as I could and made my way back to the crew quarters, my nerves on edge. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the sub, every distant thud felt like something more. I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of the submarine around me. And then I heard it. A whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the sound of the ocean pressing in against the hull. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. Words, soft and barely audible, like someone was speaking just inches from my ear. "Help. Us." I shot up in bed, my heart racing. The bunk room was dark, the only light a faint red glow from the emergency lamps. The other crew members were asleep, their soft snores filling the room. But the whisper continued, insistent, pleading. "Help us." I scrambled out of my bunk, my pulse thundering in my ears. The voice was coming from the corridor. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the hall, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and my breath fogged in front of me. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing off the metal floor. The whisper grew louder, more urgent, leading me deeper into the sub, down into the lower decks. Places we weren't supposed to go. My skin prickled with fear as I descended the ladder into the storage bay. The air here felt different, heavy, oppressive, like something was pressing down on me. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and for a moment I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. I swung the flashlight around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. "Help us." The voice was right behind me now, so close I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, but again, nothing. That's when the cold hit me. It wasn't just a chill, it was bone deep, freezing like I'd stepped into an icy tomb. My breath caught in my throat as the temperature dropped, and I felt something brush against my arm. I staggered back, my flashlight flickering wildly, and in that moment I saw them, faces, pale, ghostly faces staring at me from the darkness. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. Dozens of them, floating just beyond the edge of the light, their expressions twisted with pain and fear. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but no matter where I turned, the faces were there, closing in on me. I could hear their whispers now, louder, overlapping, a cacophony of voices begging for help, for release. "Help us!" I bolted for the ladder, my legs trembling, but something cold wrapped around my ankle, pulling me back. I screamed, kicking at the unseen force, and finally broke free, scrambling up the ladder as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was back in the control room, gasping for breath, my skin ice cold. The rest of the crew was there, wide-eyed and pale, clearly shaken by whatever they had experienced. Ramirez looked like he'd seen a ghost, literally. "You saw them too, didn't you?" he whispered. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. We tried to report it, but no one believed us. They said it was the isolation, the stress, the effects of being submerged for so long, but we knew better. Something was wrong with the black water, something ancient and restless. The next day, the sub was decommissioned again, and we were sent home. But the faces, the whispers, they never left me. Even now, in the dead of night, I hear them. They followed me. The Blackwater may be gone, but its ghosts are still out there, waiting for someone else to listen. And they always find you, in the dark. There are places in this world that should remain untouched, buried deep, hidden for a reason. I never believed in ghost stories, let alone haunted bunkers, until the day I found myself standing before one, flashlight trembling in my hand, a cold draft creeping up from below. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. It was supposed to be a routine job. My name is Owen Carter, and I've spent the better part of my career as an urban explorer, documenting forgotten places. Old factories, abandoned hospitals, derelict houses. If it was falling apart, I was there with a camera. But nothing had prepared me for the bunker hidden beneath the woods outside of Fairfield, Montana. I first heard about it in a conspiracy forum. They said the military had built a series of underground bunkers during the Cold War, some of which had been sealed off due to unexplained incidents. Most of it sounded like wild speculation, but one post stood out. An anonymous user claimed to have found an entrance and warned others to stay away. The warning, of course, did nothing but stoke my curiosity. I figured it was just another abandoned site, maybe with some local urban legend attached to it, but nothing more than that. After all, what could really be down there? I packed my gear and made the 3-hour drive to Fairfield. It was late October, and the days were growing short, leaving a permanent twilight in the forest as I parked my Jeep and trekked through the dense trees. The directions from the forum led me to a small clearing, where I finally saw it. A rusted metal hatch, partially buried under layers of moss and leaves. It was just as the post had described, completely out of place in the middle of nowhere. The hatch groaned when I pulled it open, the screech of metal against metal echoing through the woods. A ladder descended into darkness, and the smell of damp earth and mildew hit me like a wall. This wasn't just an ordinary bunker. Something about the air down there felt wrong. But I had come too far to turn back. With a deep breath, I slung my backpack over my shoulder and climbed down, my boots hitting the concrete floor with a hollow thud. The tunnel stretched out before me, barely wide enough to walk through without brushing the walls. My flashlight flickered as I made my way deeper into the bunker, its beam cutting through the thick dust hanging in the air. The walls were lined with old, rusted pipes, and faded military stencils marked the corridors. Shelter 12. Supply room. Medical. As I ventured further, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath turned to mist, and the silence was suffocating. It wasn't long before I reached a fork in the tunnel. One path led to what seemed like a storage area, while the other led to the command center, according to a faded sign. Without thinking, I chose the command center. That's when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on the walls deep within the bunker. At first, I thought it was just the pipes, maybe old systems still settling after decades of abandonment. But the tapping grew louder, more deliberate, and it seemed to follow me as I moved. I paused, listening closely. "Hello?" I called out, my voice bouncing off the concrete walls. Nothing, just the echo of my own voice. I tried to shake it off, pushing forward. The command center was a small room, mostly stripped of equipment, but a massive control panel still dominated one wall. I approached it, brushing off a layer of dust, and saw something strange. Claw marks. Deep, jagged scratches carved into the metal, as if something had tried to tear its way through. My heart began to race. Suddenly, the air grew thick and the pressure in the room changed, as if the bunker itself had come alive. I took a step back, scanning the room with my flashlight. That's when I saw it. Movement in the corner of my eye. A shadow darting just out of view, disappearing behind the control panel. I whipped the flashlight around, but there was nothing. Just empty space. But I wasn't alone. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the dark corners of the bunker. Panic surged through me. The logical part of my brain screamed that it was all in my head, but the primal fear crawling up my spine told a different story. I needed to leave. Now, I turned back toward the tunnel, moving faster now, the tapping sound growing louder with each step. But as I retraced my path, the air seemed thicker, the walls closer. I was walking faster, nearly jogging, when I realized something was very wrong. The tunnel was changing. It was no longer the straight path I had entered. The walls had shifted, narrowing in a way I couldn't explain. I stopped to get my bearings, shining the light behind me. The shadows seemed to pulse, alive, bending toward me. Then I heard it, whispers. Faint, unintelligible murmurs that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't make out the words, but it felt like they were all around me, pushing in, trapping me in this maze of concrete and shadow. "Get out," a voice whispered, clear and sharp, right next to my ear. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight shaking. But there was no one. Nothing. Just the oppressive, cold darkness. I ran. I didn't care about the equipment I left behind or the photos I hadn't taken. I just needed to escape. My footsteps echoed wildly as I sprinted back toward the ladder, the only way out of this nightmare. But no matter how fast I ran, the tunnel seemed to stretch, growing longer, endless. And then, just as my legs were burning and my lungs screamed for air, I saw it. The hatch. Relief flooded me as I scrambled up the ladder, pushing myself out into the cold night air. I slammed the hatch shut, collapsing onto the forest floor, gasping for breath. The world outside felt too bright, too alive after the suffocating darkness below. But even as I lay there, heart pounding, I could still hear it, the tapping, faint but unmistakable, coming from beneath the ground. I don't know what I encountered down there. Maybe it was some remnant of the past, a ghost of the Cold War. Or maybe something far older, something that had been buried long before the bunker was built. Whatever it was, it hadn't wanted me to leave. I never went back to that place, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The claw marks, the whispers, the shifting tunnels. There are some things that refuse to stay forgotten, no matter how deep you bury them. A few weeks after my visit, I received an anonymous email. It contained no message, just an image, one I hadn't taken. It was a photo of me standing in the control room, my back to the camera. But in the shadows behind me, barely visible, was a figure, a gaunt, hollow-eyed figure, watching. I deleted the email immediately, but it didn't matter. The nightmares had already begun, and sometimes when the house is quiet at night, I can still hear the tapping. It began with a feeling, an uneasy sensation that someone was always there watching, just out of sight. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia, the product of a stressful life and long nights alone. But I should have listened to my instincts. My name is Lydia Harper. I'm 29, living alone in a quiet suburb on the outskirts of Atlanta. Nothing ever happened in my neighborhood. The streets were lined with well-manicured lawns, and everyone knew each other, even if only in passing. My house was at the end of a cul-de-sac, nestled beneath towering oaks, a cozy place I'd worked hard to make my own after the divorce. I'd never felt unsafe there. But that changed one cold night in November. I remember it was raining, a steady drizzle that blurred the world outside my windows. I had just settled on the couch with a glass of wine, and some mindless reality TV to drown out the silence. That's when I first noticed the strange sound. A soft, repetitive tap. Not the rain, no, it was more deliberate, more insistent, like fingers drumming lightly against glass. I paused the TV and listened, heart quickening. The sound was coming from the living room window. I got up slowly, the hardwood floor creaking beneath my feet, and moved toward the window, peering through the sheer curtains. Nothing. Just darkness. The rain washing over the glass. I shook my head, laughing at myself. It was probably just the wind, maybe a branch tapping against the pane. But the tapping continued, growing louder, more rhythmic, as if whatever was making the noise was trying to get my attention. I yanked the curtains open, fully expecting to see something, a branch, a raccoon, anything. But there was nothing there. The street outside was empty, the glow of the street lamps flickering in the misty rain. That should have been the end of it. Just one of those strange, unexplainable moments you move on from. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. It lingered, creeping into my mind every time I passed by a window or heard the faint creak of floorboards beneath my feet. It was subtle at first, just the occasional glance over my shoulder, the sense that I wasn't quite alone in my own home. Then, the text started. It was late, close to midnight, when my phone buzzed from the coffee table. I glanced at the screen, expecting another spam message or an update from one of the few apps I hadn't silenced. But what I saw made my stomach drop. The message was from an unknown number. "I like your hair tonight." I blinked, confused. Was this some sort of joke? My friends didn't pull pranks like this, and besides, no one had been over. I hadn't posted any photos, hadn't sent a single text or message all evening. And yet someone I didn't know, was commenting on my appearance. I stared at the message, trying to convince myself it was just a mistake, a wrong number. But then another one came in. "You look even better when you smile." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I hadn't smiled all evening. My hands trembled as I typed out a response. "Who is this?" The reply was immediate. "Just a friend. Watching." I felt my breath catch in my throat. A friend? Number. This was something else. Something far more sinister. I jumped up from the couch, rushing to the front door to check the locks. They were secure. I checked the back door, the windows. Everything was locked tight. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number. It rang twice before going to voicemail. The voice on the other end was a man's, calm and detached. "Leave a message." I hung up, my heart pounding in my chest. Who was this person? How did they know what I looked like? How did they know where I was? I paced around the living room, trying to shake the growing panic. It had to be a prank, I told myself. Someone from work, maybe, or a neighbor trying to mess with me. But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, the fear clung to me like a shadow. For the next few days, things seemed to go back to normal. The texts stopped, and I convinced myself it had all been a weird, one-time thing. But the feeling, the sensation of being watched, never left. I found myself constantly glancing out the windows, half expecting to see someone standing there staring back at me from the shadows. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Friday, and I had just gotten home from dinner with a friend. The evening had been pleasant enough, though I couldn't fully relax. I couldn't shake the sense that someone had been watching me as I walked to my car. I parked in my driveway, the headlights illuminating the front of the house. Everything looked normal, quiet, safe. But as I stepped out of the car and made my way to the front door, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. A small object was sitting on the front step, partially hidden by the shadows. My heart raced as I crouched down to inspect it, the hair on the back of my neck prickling with unease. It was a single rose, fresh, vibrant red, with a note attached to the stem. The note simply read, "I was here." My skin crawled. I stood up quickly, scanning the street. There was no one, no car, no movement. just the stillness of the night, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. I didn't go inside right away. I couldn't. I stood there, frozen, feeling exposed and vulnerable. Whoever this person was, they had been here. They had been close enough to leave this twisted little gift at my door, close enough to know when I wasn't home. I called the police. It felt like the only logical thing to do at that point. They came, took a report, and told me they would keep an eye on the neighborhood. But I could tell they didn't take it seriously. To them, it was just a rose, a harmless prank. But to me, it was a warning. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every rustle of leaves outside sent me bolting upright in bed. I kept my phone close, staring at the screen, waiting for another message that never came. The following day, I installed cameras, front and back. If this person came again, I would catch them. I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. For a while, it worked. I watched the footage obsessively, checking every shadow, every flicker of movement. But no one showed up. Days turned into weeks, and gradually, I began to let my guard down, until the night the cameras went dark. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to a strange noise, a soft, repetitive hum, like static. Groggy and disoriented, I reached for my phone and checked the camera feed. Both cameras, front and back, were offline. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Had the power gone out? I glanced at the lamp beside my bed, but it was still on, casting its faint glow across the room. The cameras had been disabled. I leaped out of bed, grabbing the baseball bat I kept hidden in the closet. My fingers trembled as I crept down the hall toward the living room, every sense on high alert. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, suffocating. When I reached the front door, I hesitated. What if he was out there? What if he was waiting for me? I peeked through the peephole, my breath catching in my throat. Someone was standing in the middle of the street, just beyond the range of the streetlights. A tall, dark figure, completely still, watching the house. I stumbled back, panic surging through me. My hands fumbled for my phone, and I dialed 911, my voice shaky as I explained what was happening. The operator assured me that officers were on their way, but minutes felt like hours as I sat huddled in the corner of the living room, clutching the bat, staring at the front door. When the police finally arrived, the figure was gone. Vanished into the night like a ghost, leaving no trace behind. But he wasn't gone. Not really. The officers checked the perimeter, but there was nothing to find. Just as before, they took my statement, and just as before, they told me they'd keep an eye out. But I could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe me. And maybe that was the scariest part. No one believed me. No one saw the watcher in the night. The one who left roses on my doorstep and stood in the rain, just out of reach. Always watching. Always waiting. I moved out of that house a month later. Sold it, packed up, and left the city. But the truth is, no matter how far I go, I'll never feel safe again. Because wherever I am, whoever I'm with, I still feel his eyes on me, watching from the shadows. And some nights, when the wind is quiet and the world is still, I hear that faint rhythmic tapping at my window. I should have listened to the old man. That's the first thought that comes to mind when I wake up, gasping for air, in the middle of the night. My heart hammers in my chest, and for a brief moment, I forget where I am. But then the heavy smell of damp earth reminds me. The cursed land, they called it. An area deep in the mountains of Appalachia, where no one dared to go. But I went anyway. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I was just looking for an escape. A place far from the crowded city, from the stress and noise. I needed solitude, peace, something you can only find in nature. When I first heard about the untouched land nestled between rugged hills, I thought I had found my paradise. The land had been abandoned for decades, maybe longer. According to the locals, people used to live there once, but no one could say for sure what happened to them. The only thing they agreed on was that anyone who tried to settle there never lasted long. Strange accidents, illnesses, and disappearances plagued anyone who dared step foot on that land. I didn't believe any of it. I'm not superstitious, and the idea of cursed land seemed laughable. In fact, it intrigued me. I'm a photographer by trade, and the prospect of capturing the eerie beauty of such a place was irresistible. So, against everyone's warnings, I packed my gear and drove out to the Appalachian foothills. The road to the land was barely a road, more like a forgotten trail choked with weeds and fallen branches. It was already late afternoon when I arrived, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. The place was strange. It felt like it hadn't changed in 100 years. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. The air was thick with the smell of damp moss and decaying leaves. I set up camp near the ruins of an old cabin, the only sign that people had ever lived here. The structure was crumbling, with its roof collapsed and ivy creeping up the stone walls. Yet, there was something unsettling about it, like it was watching me. By nightfall, the place felt even more eerie. There were no sounds of animals, no rustling of leaves, no chirping insects, just an oppressive silence that hung in the air. I remember thinking how strange that was. In the wilderness, you're never really alone. But here, it felt like I was. I shrugged off the unease and focused on my photography, capturing the stark beauty of the place. But as the hours passed, I started to feel it, that creeping sensation, like I wasn't alone. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination, but the feeling wouldn't go away. That night, the nightmares began. They weren't normal dreams. They were vivid, terrifying, like I was trapped in a dark place where something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The shadows in my dreams had eyes, cold, hungry eyes. Every time I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, I could still feel their presence, lingering around me. On the third day, I found the symbols. I was wandering through the woods, looking for new angles to shoot, when I noticed something carved into the trees. They weren't random marks. They were deliberate, etched deep into the bark. Circles, crosses, strange shapes that made my skin crawl just by looking at them. The further I went, the more of these symbols I found, as if they formed some kind of boundary. I should have left right then. Every instinct told me to pack up and get the hell out of there. But I was stubborn. I convinced myself it was just the remnants of some old cult or superstition, and there was no real danger. That evening, the sun set faster than I expected, and I found myself walking back to camp in near darkness. As I crossed through the trees, I felt it again, that sensation of being watched, but this time it was stronger. I could hear something moving through the brush just beyond my line of sight. At first I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but then I heard the breathing. Slow, deliberate, like someone was following me, matching my every step. I quickened my pace, heart racing, trying to tell myself it was nothing. But the breathing followed me, closer and closer. I broke into a run, and that's when I saw them, shadows, moving between the trees. I couldn't make out their shapes, but there were figures just beyond the reach of the fading light. I ran the rest of the way to camp, barely able to breathe by the time I reached the clearing. The moment I crossed the threshold of the ruins, the feeling stopped. The air was still again. The silence returned. But something had changed. The cabin. It looked different. The ivy-covered walls that had once seemed decrepit and old now stood taller, more intact. And then I realized there was light inside. Faint, flickering candlelight. My legs trembled as I approached. I hadn't lit a fire. There was no reason for the cabin to be illuminated like that. But there it was, glowing softly from within. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer and peeked inside. The room was empty. except for a single wooden chair placed directly in the center. On the chair sat a bundle of old, weathered cloth. My heart sank as I realized what it was. A doll, crudely stitched together, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight at me. I staggered back, tripping over my own feet. The shadows outside the window shifted, and I heard the faintest whisper, barely audible over the pounding in my ears. Leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my gear and ran, not stopping until I reached my car. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the cabin, perfectly intact, glowing in the night, like it had never been abandoned. But the worst part? When I got back to the town and told the locals what had happened, they just shook their heads. One of the old men at the diner leaned in and said, "You're lucky. Most people don't make it out once they've been marked." I didn't know what he meant by that, and I didn't want to. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't done with that cursed land. Not yet. It's been weeks since I left, but the dreams haven't stopped. Every night, I'm back there, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching the cabin in the distance, and every night the shadows come closer. I don't think I can outrun it. The curse. It's not tied to the land. It's tied to me, and I'm starting to wonder if I'll ever be free.